Hi everyone, you're here sewing with Cody and Pete, and this video is going to be working on something specific. We are going to be focusing on the multiple different securing functions on the BERNINA machines. Now, every level of BERNINA machine has different ways to secure our stitches. We're going to be working on the 770, which has pretty much all of the different securing functions. Some of the lower end models have some of the same exact ones, but maybe not all of them. So we're going to be working on the 770. I'm going to be showing you all the different ways you can secure your stitches to keep the fabric from, or keep your stitches from unraveling, or to keep your fabric from pulling out, or your stitches from pulling out, really. So let's get started. But if you enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up at any point throughout the video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So now let's take a closer look at all the different ways that we can secure our stitches on the BERNINA machines. Alright, so here we are on the BERNINA 770, but like I mentioned before, these functions apply to the majority of all the BERNINA machines. Some of the buttons may be in a slightly different location, but nowadays the user interface is identical throughout all lines of BERNINA machines with the touchscreen, but some machines like the 790 have extra buttons here. So when we're referring to a securing stitch, it's the most basic securing stitch that everyone knows when dealing with any brand of machine, no matter how old really, is basically a back stitch. So right here on the BERNINA machines we have the reverse. So typically when we start sewing, if we want to secure that stitch to make it basically prevent it from pulling out, we'll take a few stitches forward and then press the reverse, and as long as we're pressing that reverse, the machine will sew backwards, and as soon as we release, it will continue to start sewing forwards, and that is like back stitching. That's one of the most common ways to secure our stitches. But with these machines, you've got multiple ways to secure your stitches, and so the premise behind this video, basically what sparked this video, was I was just recently sitting with a customer and we literally spent 30 minutes going over, because she was a new BERNINA customer, but we spent 30 minutes going over just all the different ways and the detail in which we can secure our stitches. So like I mentioned before, one of the most popular is using the reverse. So the way this works is, so if you press on your foot pedal, bring down our foot, but we can start stitching. So we'll take a few stitches typically, and we'll tap this, we'll hold down this reverse, and take a few stitches back, release, and then we'll start sewing forward. And we can do the same thing when we get to the end. We can just press and hold that reverse, it will sew backwards, and then we can continue to stitch and then stop whenever we want. And we can press our thread cutter, and with the 770 it brings the foot up. Some other models like the 475, for instance, we have to manually bring up our foot. But as we can see here, we have some back stitching here and some back stitching here. That's why I chose black thread, so we can really see it. But one thing I want you to take note of is this is pretty consistent. Basically I went forward and I went back pretty much the same amount, so I didn't exceed where I started. Now here we have some extra back stitching here, but then just some forward stitching. So it's really secure here, but not so secure here. But this is way more secure than just sewing a straight line and then stopping and cutting. So this is the most basic form of secure, which pretty much everybody knows. So while talking about a back stitching, the BERNINA machines have a specific stitch. So on this machine and on most machines with a touchscreen, stitch number 5, we can see here on the screen. So if I hit stitch number 5, if you notice, nothing really changes, because stitch number 5, stitch number 1, they're both naturally straight stitches. But you can alter stitch number 5 to be a zigzag as well. So, but what stitch number 5 is, it's a fantastic stitch. I may have talked about this stitch in previous videos, but I want to focus on securing stitches in general. So what stitch number 5 does is, so if we start stitching, so it will stitch forward 5 stitches and then go 5 stitches back and then continue forward. It will continue forward in that straight stitch until we tap the reverse. So I tap the reverse, it goes back 5 stitches and comes forward 5 stitches. but I'm still applying pressure, so it stops automatically. So I let off the foot pedal, and then now I can press my thread cutter, and now we'll see something a little different from what we saw the first time, where it was more like in manual mode. But so here we can see a distinct 5 stitches forward, 5 stitches back, and then it continued forward. And as soon as I tapped that reverse at the very end, so you end with stitch number 5, whenever you reach the end of your fabric or the end of where you want that stitch to stop, you just tap that reverse. It will then go back 5 stitches and then come forward 5 stitches and stop exactly where you tapped that reverse. So at that point you could just press your thread cutter and then you're done. But so this is an excellent way, so you get a very consistent look. You don't have something that looks like this or that looks like this. So stitch number 5 is wonderful. The beauty of stitch number 5 is we can turn that straight stitch into a zigzag. So let's leave it at that. So what we'll do here is we'll start stitching. It'll take 5 stitches forward, 5 stitches back, and then continue forward. I can tap that reverse. It will go 5 back, 5 forward, and then stop. So even with stitch number 5, we can do a secure zigzag. So as you can see here, look, it crossed over back and forth beautifully. Did an excellent job. And so this is nice and secure. So the stitch is very unlikely to come unthreaded, or if we were to pull on it, it's not going to come undone. Because we just didn't stop, we actually backstitched and greatly secured it. So in my opinion, backstitching, securing a stitch in this method is the strongest form of securing a stitch. So now let's go look at our other options when securing stitches. So the other option, so we'll click on the little eye here and we'll see this little knot. So on some machines, and some of the older machines, we have a specific button that's on the machine itself that looks just like that little knot, or like a little pretzel, depending on how hungry you are, is depending on what you see. I sometimes typically see a nice soft cinnamon sugar pretzel when I see that little knot. So but what this does is, so if you ever want to have your stitch secure right before you start or right when you're done, you can click this button. So when you click it, you'll see it highlights in yellow, and you'll see the little knot, also known as a pretzel, down at the bottom here. So if I start sewing, what you'll notice is the machine will actually stitch in place about 4 times before the feed dogs actually start moving the fabric. So as you can see here, it's stitching in place, and then it continues to stitch forward. So also, if I reach the end, to say, okay, this is as far as I want to go, I can hit my little knot again, and it will stitch in place at that point. And then it will start stitching forward. So at that point, you would want to stop. And then we can press our thread cutter, and then it will raise everything up. And now we'll see, it's very difficult to see, which is the whole point of this type of secure, is it's almost an invisible secure. So it's kind of knotting in place. So here we can see a little extra stitching in place here, and the same thing right here. So this stitching is excellent for more of a woven fabric like we have here, something that can support that type of stitching in place. So here we've got 4 to 5 stitches in one spot. If we were dealing with the knit or like a satin or a fabric that would run, or a fabric that could create a hole like a knit fabric, I would not recommend this type of secure. Or if we're dealing with a fabric that has a fairly large open weave, then this type of secure isn't very secure. But if we're dealing with like a satin, for instance, by stitching in place in one spot for so long, your fabrics can run and basically ruin the look of that area, the fabric, by stitching in one spot. So those types of fabric, like a fabric that has a larger open weave, say like a linen or like a satin, I would more highly recommend a back stitch, because that's going to secure the fabric better and not prevent any damage to the fabric. So secure the stitches better, I'm sorry, and it will least likely prevent any damage to the fabric. So that is the little knot function. So if you wanted to do it in the beginning, you can hit it right before you start. If you want at the end, you can hit it again right when you're at the end of where you want to stitch. Now on these machines, we can also go to the setting. We can go to our sewing settings, and I can come to this button right here. So here we have a needle with our little knot. So right now I have this turned off. So what this is most of the machines come with this turned on by default. Typically I always turn them off when I sew out machines before we sell them, because most people don't want this function on, or at least not in the beginning. So what this is going to do is, with this on, with the little green line, is every single time we start sewing, it's going to knot our thread, just like we saw here. So if we are quilting, for instance, or let's say, if we are piecing our quilt together, we do not want it to tie off in the beginning every single time. Well, it just adds time. But typically, when we're starting on the very edge of our fabric, and usually we're not even on the fabric at that point when we're starting. So if we had it secure, if we had it stitched 4 times when we were off the edge of the fabric, it's going to end up jamming up the machine. Potentially, it's going to pull this tail underneath. It's just going to cause problems because we're not securing our stitch, but it's trying to secure our stitch because there's no fabric underneath there. So that's something that you need to pay attention to and take note of, is if you're using the stitch in place method, that'll tie off function, you want to make sure that you're doing this always over fabric, because it can cause problems. But we'll see here, when we start sewing, something to also take note of is sometimes when we change our settings, like we did with the secure in the beginning, it does not take effect that very first stitching. So if you turned off that securing function, the very first stitch once you start sewing, it won't turn it off, nor will it turn it on. However, after that first stitch, and then you go and do it, it will either have turned on or turned off. So we can see here it secures it in the beginning all by itself. We didn't have to tell it. And then when we're at the end, we can just press our thread cutter and it will turn it off. So to reiterate, here in our settings, this will knot the thread in the beginning every single time we start. So a question that the customer had was, what if I start sewing and I pause and I start sewing again? Well, according to the machine, the way the machine saw what we did is the machine saw it as a pause. The machine did not see it as starting to sew again. When we use our thread cutter, this resets that stitch. So now the machine knows, okay, when the customer, either he or she, starts sewing again, it's starting at the very beginning. So it knows that it needs to secure that stitch because that stitch was cut. So when we start sewing again, you'll see it knots off, and then it'll continue to sew. It will not knot off even if we were to, say, use the hover feature and pivot. That's not the beginning. It will just continue to sew. It will not knot off. It will only knot off after we press the thread cutter. So there is another way to secure our stitches. So right now, the way we have it set is it will knot and secure that stitch in the beginning, but it won't do it in the end. If we wanted to do it in the end, we would have to press the little knot on the screen, and then it'll stop and secure it. But another way we can do this is by programming our thread cutter button. So if we go to our settings, go to our sewing settings again, and go to our icon or button settings, we see that we have a little pair of scissors. So I can click on the little pair of scissors, and you can see how I have my machine set, which is how I personally like it, unless I'm doing something specific. I have it set so whenever I press the thread cutter, as you've seen multiple times just in this video, when I press the thread cutter, it will just cut my thread and raise my foot up. That's how I like it, because I always know what it's going to do. But if I want it, or if I need it to secure my stitch, before it cuts, I can come here and say, okay, I want you to secure my stitch before you cut the thread. And as you see, you've got two different options here, because there are two different types of securing your stitches. So the first option here, where you see those 5 little dots kind of in the center. So this will secure, just like we've been seeing, it will secure by stitching in place. So basically just kind of stitch a little knot. This is fine for like woven cotton fabrics or woven polyester fabrics. But if we're dealing with a knit, if we're dealing with a satin, if we're dealing with fabrics that are going to run, or something that's really, really delicate, we have another option, and that's this one right here. So this option, what it will do is it will actually stitch forward, just like it's been sewing, but it stitches forward very, very close together. So the stitches just are really almost on top of each other, but they are in a row. So it's less likely for the fabric to run, it's less likely for it to create a hole in a knit, and if we're dealing with a slightly larger open weave, it's more likely to actually secure that stitch. And here, as you can see, you can tell it how many times it's going to stitch forward. Typically by default it's 4 times. So we'll have it set for this, and I'll show you what this looks like. So if we start sewing, it should tie off in the beginning, because that's how we have it set. And as it starts to sew, say if I reach the end of where I want to stop sewing and I hit my thread cutter, you'll see it stitches and then it cuts my thread. So what it did, we'll take a closer look, is you can see my stitches here, and then you can see right here you got 4 stitches. They're very, very close together. So that's its way of, you can see them kind of here too. That's another way to secure your stitches. One, using the thread cutter, but you've got 2 different ways it can kind of knot that thread. So you can have it stitch, continue to stitch forward multiple times, and then cut the thread, or you can have it stitch in basically one spot and then cut our thread. The downside to this method is if you stop where you want to stop and you don't want to come forward anymore, this method is still going to come forward a number of very tight stitches, and it may encroach in another part of your fabric that you don't want to encroach upon. There is another method for securing our stitches, and this one's a little different. So this one is using our pattern end button. So a quick explanation of the pattern end button is our pattern end button is, I always like to work with my little flower. So the pattern end button, when we press this button, it will light up. So you'll see a little light appear. You'll see a little stop sign on the screen. And so what this will do is, depending on what pattern we're on, so say if we're halfway through or a quarter of the way through stitching our little flower here, and you'll see that little white dot. So you will hit this button when you are on your last pattern, basically the last pattern that you want to stitch. And when you hit it, it will finish that pattern. So it won't stop with an incomplete pattern. And it will then stop, and depending on how you have it set in your settings will depend on what it does next. So let's go to our settings and let's see what we can change that pattern end button to. So here's our pattern end. So I can click here. So we've got multiple options for our pattern end. So currently, as you see it, when I hit my pattern end button, it's going to finish that pattern, and then it's just going to stop at the end, or basically at the beginning of the next one. It's just going to stop. It's not going to do anything else. So if I want to cut my thread, I can use my thread cutter. If I want to knot my thread, I can always hit the little knot underneath the little I screen. But here I can have it knot my thread, cut my thread, and then raise my foot up. And as you can see here, we have those 2 different options for a knot. So what this is going to do, so if we are stitching our flower, for instance, so let's stitch it. And you can see that little white dot. Oh, well, we have it selected as well. So let's see. So it's actually going to stitch just the one flower because we hit this before we went to our settings. So let's start sewing. There we go. So it will stitch the flower, as many flowers or as many stitches as we want. It'll just keep stitching and stitching and stitching. So when you reach the last pattern you want to stitch, so let's say this is the last flower because I'm not going to run out of room. I can hit the pattern end button. It will continue stitching, and it tied off, cut the thread, and raise the foot up. So it just knotted in place, cut it, and then raise the foot up. So it completed our flower. It didn't give us an incomplete flower. It just finished it. Because typically the stitch is underneath the foot and really can't see where it's at in the completion of our design. So we can't see it. So by hitting this, it allows us to finish it, and then we can also have it tie off the thread, cut it, and raise the foot up just like we saw. So I may be missing another way to secure our stitches, but to review, we use the manual method of just doing a reverse in the beginning and in the end. We use the thread cutter by going into the settings and setting it to secure or knot off our thread before it cuts. We just did the pattern end, where we told it to finish that pattern, and then when it's done, secure the stitch and then cut the thread and raise the foot up. And of course, we have kind of like a manual, just like we have here, manual reverse. We have a manual method of telling it, okay, I want it to secure before you start sewing, and once you start sewing, that is complete, so deselect. So you can always hit it when you're done sewing. When you reach the end, it will secure in that spot, and then you can stop and then press the thread cutter. So those are many different ways to secure your stitches while sewing on the BERNINA machines. So remember, if you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, give it a thumbs up, and always subscribe to the channel so you see more videos that will come your way dealing with BERNINA machines, sewing techniques, Burnett machines, thread, gadgets, whatever I happen to come across that I feel is necessary to get out to everyone. So different things that I find helpful. Always subscribe to the channel and you'll see when those videos become available. Also, if you want like instant notification, I always forget to mention there's a little bell icon below the video screen. If you hit that, you actually get a notification when I upload a new video. All right, stay tuned for new videos about all kind of different sewing stuff and what I'm working on. So, as always, happy sewing.